In 20 minutes, I'd like to talk to you about why you shouldn't buy presents for the holidays. At least that's sort of the theme. You know, why am I criticizing Christmas? What did Santa ever do to me? I mean, there was no childhood insult or trauma. It's just that I got a PhD in economics, and it really somehow, sometimes education works. It sinks in, it begins to change the way you think, and you look around and you say, this isn't what I learned at school. You know, normally people buy things for themselves, and it tends to work out well, and holiday gift giving is not like that at all. Others are buying for us. And so I'll try to convince you in 20 minutes that the way we celebrate Christmas around the developed world is with an orgy of value destruction that vaporizes $25 billion per year. Well, nothing bombastic, but that's the plan. So what's the problem with holiday spending? Normally, I'll only spend, say, $50 on myself if I find something that's worth at least $50 to me. So normally, whatever amount of spending we see, we can safely infer, or at least reasonably infer, that at least that much satisfaction got generated by the spending. Holiday gift giving, or any kind of gift giving really, is quite different. When I set out to spend $50 on you, I'm operating at a significant disadvantage. I don't know what you have. I don't know what you like. I might spend $50 and buy something worth nothing to you. That's the worst case. Now, you know, that raises so that's sort of the theory here. The question, though, is what really does happen. So what I've done over the years, starting in 1992, is to do surveys. I do surveys of gift recipients, asking them questions. So who gave you, so make a list of the gifts you've received. Who gave it to you? What do you think the giver paid? You know, by the way, what is it? You know, a CD, a sweater, whatever. And what would you have been willing to pay for that thing? Not the sentimental value of that thing, but just that thing that you got. And in more recent years, about the last 10 years or so, I've also added to the survey a set of questions about items people had purchased for themselves. And so on the basis of, you know, all this data I've generated, I come to the conclusion that people value the items they receive as gifts 20% less per dollar spent than the items they purchase for themselves. Again, because these are items that are not well suited for their tastes. The wrong size, the wrong color, the wrong thing, and so forth. Now, how does this happen? Well, of course, you know, it's customary for economists and other, I think, common sense people to assume that we are best in possession of information about what we like. You know, so we know our own preferences. When we set out to buy things, we tend to do pretty well. Now, of course, we're not perfectly informed, and by the way, that gives some scope for others to maybe do better for us. We're not perfectly informed, and we're not perfect decision makers, but by and large, I think we tend to assume that, you know, we're better than others at choosing for us. And in fact, that's the basis for many economists' condemnation of government. Right? When government makes decisions for us and builds bridges to nowhere or whatever your kind of favorite kind of project that seems not worthwhile, that's like a form of gift giving, though, you know, where you get something you didn't want and it's a big waste of your money. But you know, if we're going to be consistent about it then, and imagine when others are choosing for us, it might be bad. We ought to be consistent and say, well, what about in the private so-called voluntary sphere? Might we also have these problems? And yeah, my result is 20%. Yeah, apparently we do. So some gift givers, it turns out, do worse than others. Let me say, so I say there's 20% in sort of missing value on average across all kinds of giving and recipient relationships. But it varies depending on you know, who the giver is in relation to the recipient. There's a lot of variation. And so you know, the givers who are in less frequent contact with the recipients actually tend to do a lot worse than givers who are in more frequent contact and therefore who would be more knowledgeable about the tastes of the recipients. And so here it goes. Every year I trot this out, and I feel a little guilty about this, kind of making some fun at grandma's expense, but there it is. Grandparents, aunts and uncles, siblings. Now here parents are just normalized to zero, but sort of relative to each other. And then friends do well, and significant others do very well. And this really comports with what one would expect. Who knows a lot about what you want and need? And by the way, it's not that grandparents and aunts and uncles are inherently bad at this. It's that they don't see you very often. And by the way, whose fault is that? So I really want to be clear, I'm not heaping criticism on Grandma. I'm guilty, I feel guilty about the chuckles generated at her expense over the years, and it's really not her fault. Now, an argument I often hear, you know, at this point in the discussion is that, no, Waldfogel, you're missing the point entirely. Gift giving is about the joy of giving, and where is that in all this? And so let's talk through an example to make clear that although I think joy of giving is quite important, I don't think it undermines this argument. So I buy you a sweater for $50. It's only worth $30 to you. So far, this transaction is a loser as an economic transaction. But I get $30 more worth of joy of giving out of it. 30 plus 30 is 60. 60 is bigger than 50. Waldfogel, you're a moron. Well, my response to that is, but if I also got the $30 worth of joy of giving out of giving you something you actually wanted, that would have produced 80 or more worth of satisfaction. 80 is bigger than 60. I'm not a moron. So, but more seriously, the question is can givers get an equivalent amount of joy out of giving things that are more efficient for the recipient? And that's not obvious, but I think the answer is yes. But if you think the answer is no, then you have a quibble with me, a reasonable one. And for example, there are certain situations in which I would not get equal amounts of joy out of giving the thing the recipient wants. What does a 10-year-old boy want? He wants 20 pounds of candy. And I think he ought to have a hat. Would I be as happy giving him 20 pounds of candy? No. So that's a paternalistic instance where I don't respect his preferences. He's an idiot. I should give him something good for him. And if your friend's an IV drug user, he wants cash. Don't give it to him. Give him soup. But I don't think that describes the vast lot of gift giving. In fact, there's evidence that doesn't describe it in the sense that people who tend to do poorly choosing gifts are more likely to choose the flexible gift of cash. Okay? So I think there's evidence that people are trying to respect the preferences of their recipients rather than paternalistically kind of tell them what to do. I would say, though, with your kids, give them what you think they should have when they're little, because they don't know anything. All right, another criticism I hear a lot, and it's an important one, but isn't spending good for the economy? Why are you criticizing spending? And you're from the Wharton School, you're going to get in trouble. Well, what does good for the economy actually mean? Good for the economy, there are two parties to every transaction. There's a buyer and a seller. And at least to economists, good for the economy means maximizing the sum of the surplus experienced by the buyer and the seller. So what is the surplus for the seller? Well, basically it's profit. There's a price that's higher than the cost, and so that there's some surplus there, and profit's a good thing. Not just because I'm from the Wharton School, but economists think of that as a good form of surplus. On the buyer side, there's another surplus. The buyer gets something that he or she values higher than the price that they pay, and so there's some surplus on the consumer side. And that, when we leave people to themselves in perfectly competitive markets, we maximize the sum of those surpluses, and everybody goes home happy. And that's what Adam Smith said, but in more eloquent terms. Now, with holiday gift giving, it's a little bit different. It is still true that sellers get prices that exceed their costs and therefore profits, so, check. On the buyer side, though, or the consumer side, it's no longer the case that the ultimate consumer of the object, in this case the gift recipient, gets something worth more than the price, or worth more than what that amount of money spent by him or herself would have produced for them in satisfaction. So is it good for the economy? Well, it's good for the seller, but not so much for the buyer. So I guess, was it good for you, dear? Okay. Now, it's getting a little dreary here, so I should to talk a little bit about how gift giving actually can be transcendent as opposed to just value destroying. The textbook answer is the best thing to do is cash because the recipient knows what he wants and only he or she should be allowed to decide. But in truth, of course, that's naive. There are often situations in which there are items out there that our recipients don't know about. If we know them well, we know a lot about this category of products, say music, books, whatever, we might be able to find something that they wouldn't purchase for themselves, but had they known about it, they would have. So it's better than they would have done with the money themselves. I would term that search. So economists talk about the process of getting informed about what's available as search. I think sometimes our givers are in a position to do things, especially when the givers know us well. So that's one way giving could be transcendent. Where transcendent, I'm an economist, so it only means better than what you would have done for yourself. Another form of transcendence, I think, especially within the family, I think of as permission. So a few years back, I wanted to buy a very fancy digital camera, at least fancy for me, and I didn't feel comfortable just doing this because I have kids and a wife, and that's a lot of money. At some point, my wife said, "Oh no, go ahead. You should buy that for yourself." That's the best gift ever, right? I bought this thing that, left to my own devices, I would have just pined for, but instead I got permission to buy it, and I'm way better off than I would have been had I just gone to the store and come home unhappy. So the point being, it's not impossible to give great gifts, to do better than cash. It's just hard, okay? The average is 20% destruction, but there's a lot of variation around that. If you think you're a great gift giver, you may well be. All right. How much spending? So we have a 20% in sort of missing value. What do we need to multiply that by to see how big? I guess I already told you it's 25 billion. In the US, you know, we spend about $65 billion a year on holiday gifts, and that's a conservative measure. That's like the December spike in spending compared to the months around it. Actually, I have some sort of neat slides if I can go to the next one. This is just 2007. This is monthly, non-seasonally adjusted retail sales. And turns out, I'll show you this for many countries, but a typical year, you know, you're kind of humming along, and then boom, you go up in December, then you go way back down in January and February, then you kind of hum along again. And let's go to the next one, the previous year. Same kind of story, and the next one is yet the previous year. Same kind of story. Big spike in December. This is America, the home of you know, excessive consumption, right? But the difference between December and the average of November and January strikes me as a reasonable way to measure this. About 65 billion in the U.S. 65 billion times 20 is about 13 billion in the U.S. Now, you know, there are folks who get very upset about waste. In the U.S., we have this watchdog group called the Citizens Against Government Waste, and they scour the federal budget looking for wasteful projects, and they define something as wasteful if its benefit is less than its cost. And in the whole U.S. federal budget, they found $17 billion worth of waste. Well, using their definition of waste, all of holiday spending is waste. So if you're going to get upset at Uncle Sam, our personification of government in the U.S., you ought to be pretty mad at Santa Claus too, is at least my argument about consistency. So can I have some outrage here, please? Now, the U.S. is not alone. You know, I had thought surely we Americans lead the world in excess because, you know, we lead the world in obesity, we lead the world in gasoline consumption, we lead the world in lots of things that, well, some of which I'm proud of, but some of which I'm not so proud of. And so how do we compare to other countries? The next slide puts the U.S. in the context of a bunch of Western European countries. This, again, is the year 2007. And what you see is that the U.S., we are not alone. All the countries in this graph have a December spending spike, and 2007 is in no way unusual. So Western Europe is like the US in this respect. How about the next slide? Eastern Europe. Sure enough, Eastern Europe too. Look at the Russians. You know, a century of godless communism. Look at that. In fact, so since they liberalized both religiously and economically, we can compare, think about this December spending spike, the proportionate increase in December relative to the months around it. And we can look at this over time, back to, say, 1990 for the Russians. The next slide compares the Russians to the Americans. And look at that. The Russians here are rendered in red. And look at that. The Russians actually overtake the US in 2005. I don't know if this is a cause for happiness or sadness, but it is interesting, right? It is interesting. This is the emerging Santa Claus gap, if you're a fan of Dr. Strangelove, as I am. How about other countries? Let's see the next slide, sort of some countries not elsewhere classified from the OECD, and we see big bumps there as well, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa. Let's have one more set of countries that are a little bit different. So China, Israel, South Korea, Japan. How are these countries similar? Well, they don't have a lot of Christians. And in fact, for the most part, they don't have a lot of December spending. Now, the Israelis, it's interesting, American Jews do give holiday gifts in December to ape the Christians. In Israel, though, the holidays that prompt gift giving are Passover in the spring and the New Year in the fall. And so they do have spending spikes, but not in December. China is different. South Korea is different. Japan has very few Christians, but they do celebrate Christmas as a secular holiday. There's a ritual rendition of the Ninth Symphony and some kind of a fruitcake. And it does generate a lot of spending, apparently. Now, I'm also told there's something about New Year's that prompts spending in December, but there's a spike there in December. So the point here is that we're not alone. Now, how about ranking? This is the important thing is not just whether we're alone, but who's biggest. So let's see the next slide. So this is a slide that ranks countries by this proportionate December spending spike. December relative to the 2 months around it. In the lead since the year 2000 are Hungary, Italy, Portugal, Brazil, Norway. There's the UK, and if we just pop this thing ahead one, we'll see the US down here. So I was a little surprised the US is really kind of far down this list in sort of how big a deal we make out of Christmas relative to the rest of the year. Now, of course, it could be because we're making too big a deal or a big deal of the whole rest of the year. But in any event, we're pretty far down this list. And it's not just since 2000. The next slide has the same picture since the 90s. And the UK there is over there in green, the US down here in red. And the next couple of slides, we can do this kind of quickly. Same story. The country coverage varies over time in the OECD data. But nevertheless, you've got the UK there, the US down here. The US is sort of a picture of moderation here. I think I'm proud of that. I can't decide. But So I think we have it back a couple more decades, 70s and 60s. We see the same pattern emerging. Another way to do this is in sort of per capita spending terms. And when you do that, it's a little challenging because getting comparable retail sales actual data as opposed to indices is hard. But nevertheless, in those rankings, the US is not even in the top 10. So good news for defensive Americans, but bad news for the world. This problem I identify as a 13 billion problem in the US turns out to be a $25 billion problem around the world. So I think probably the bad news outweighs the good. Just making me feel better isn't probably an important world priority. All right. One question, how much time do I have? I'm trying to decide what to omit. No, I'm okay? Okay. So a question, that I got thinking about is, did we invent this? That is, did our generation invent this, this wasteful or at least excessive or high spending? I should be careful about the words that involve making judgments. In any event, I think every generation thinks that it invented sex. Every generation thinks that it invented the vulgar commercialization of Christmas. Is that so? Did our generation invent this? In the US, I can get pretty detailed spending data back to 1935 and then some other interesting spending data back to about 1919. This is the spending data back to 1990, and you see that this spike's been there regularly going back. It rises because there's been inflation, but there's this big spike every year. Let's go back. One more slide. Back to 1980. It's there. Let's keep going. Back to 67. It's there. Every year it's there. The next slide, we'll slow down now. What this does, it just takes that December spike relative, so the red is relative to January, the blue is relative to November. This is back to 1935, and you see it's essentially constant. With, one exception that we'll talk about later is that the January, relative to January, it's actually declined substantially in the last 15 years, and that's something interesting. But basically, this is a constant bump in spending back to 1935. We can go back earlier. Prior to 1935, the statistics were kept in a different way. They were kept by category of store. There were these stores called dime stores like Woolworth's, and then there were mail order houses like Sears and Montgomery Ward's. But I have the next slide is 10-cent stores, dime stores in 1919, and that's a really quite a large bump. Look at that. It goes up over 100, whereas it had been around 50, so it's 100%, whereas Hungary was only 50%. So the dime stores were, Christmas was a big phenomenon at the dime stores in 1919 and throughout the 20s, as the next slide shows. So I think I probably convinced you, this avalanche of statistics, that December, relative to the months around it, has been a big deal for most of the last century, or roughly a century. Now, in fact, in the last 3 generations or so, since 1935, the US economy has grown by a factor of 5. What about holiday gift spending? By my measure, it's grown by a factor of 3. So in some sense, holiday gift spending is a smaller deal today than it was 3 generations ago. And we can take that a bit farther. Imagine the 20th century as a big experiment to see what happens when people get richer. Well, they spent more on Christmas, but not as much more as they got richer. In other words, in jargon, the income elasticity of demand for holiday spending is less than 1, or it's a necessity, not a luxury. Something we have to do, not necessarily something we seem to want to do. That is, maybe we want to give, but the amount we give, doesn't seem to respond like a luxury. Okay, we can be more explicit about that and ask, is Christmas like Spam, which is the chicken, or caviar? These are the paradigmatic necessity or inferior necessity and luxury goods. And so the data over time suggests it's like a necessity. There are other data one can look at over time. Oh yeah, I forgot about that one, but there's other data one can look at over time that literally by category of expenditure. And so why don't we jump to the next slide? And what this slide has is just, these are the income elasticities of demand for categories of expenditure. If it's above 1, it's a luxury. The smaller it is, the more it is like a necessity. And so I've put sort of the usual categories one can find in the US data in what are called the national income and product accounts. So on the left, we see medical care, which sadly is a luxury good in the US. And as we go to the right, we get to stuff like clothing and shoes and food, which are plausibly necessities, and the data show they are as well. Where's Christmas retail? If you take it ahead 1, you can get the circle around Christmas. There it is between gasoline and food. So yeah, it's a necessity. It confirms the other kind of broad overtime data that holiday spending behaves like a necessity, and a necessity with all the glamour of gasoline and food. So I think one could view that as evidence that people view Christmas giving as more of an obligation than something they're eager to do more of if only they had some more money. All right. We could talk a little bit about how we finance Christmas. I mean, we're kind of debt crazy in the U.S. We borrow a lot. It wasn't always so. In the 1930s, we had things called Christmas clubs. I think you may have had them as well. People put money in a little bit each week, and it accumulated. And then in December, people took it out to buy gifts. And in some sense, I think economists used to look at these and say, "What are people, idiots? I mean, they don't pay much interest. Why would anyone put money in one of these?" Of course, now we have something called behavioral economics, and we know that people are idiots. And so these are actually helpful devices to overcome self-control problems. And so, and in fact, in the old days, about 10% or 15% of U.S. holiday spending was financed with money from Christmas club accounts, not counting other savings. Since then, especially since about 1970, credit in the U.S. has grown enormously. Now we have about $1 trillion. That's with a T in credit. Revolving credit, not counting the borrowing for houses and cars and stuff, just the revolving credit stuff. So it's really quite enormous. The next slide just shows you a picture. There's the Christmas club thing. We can jump over that. But there's the enormous credit card debt. But the next slide focuses in on just one particular year. So what I want to focus on here is the change in the way we financed Christmas. So remember, the spending data show a spike in December followed by a trough in January. If we paid off the card in the month in which we incurred the expense, the debt data would go up and come right back down. Instead, so the red line here is December in 2007. Well, what happens is we put a lot on the card, but then it doesn't fall back down. Instead, we coast back down toward the trend because we're still paying it off January, February, March, etc. Pretty substantial shares of it are still being paid off in the months after. So we've really changed the way we finance it. Now, as a card-carrying economist, I'm not supposed to say that credit is bad. After all, credit expands your opportunities. So it allows your present self to buy something that your future self can afford and so forth. But, anything you'd be embarrassed to tell your mother, probably not entirely good. And, furthermore, if you look at some of the kind of worst forms of credit, payday lending, the interest rates are effectively thousands of % per year. You look at when payday lending reaches a peak in the U.S., it's around New Year's. So, I don't know. I'm not prepared to say it's bad because I'll lose my economics license, but nevertheless, it's a little questionable. All right, let's skip the next few slides. We don't need them to make the point, but let's get to. So let me talk about gift cards. So gift cards or gift vouchers, as you call them here, they seem like an appealing idea from a theoretical standpoint. Actually, the most appealing idea from a naive theoretical standpoint is cash, right? If I give you cash, putting aside those transcendent gifts, if I give you cash, at least you can sort of do as well as you would have done. But I think we know as humans, and actually psychologists know as scholars, that cash is a socially stigmatized, awkward gift. It's really not something you can give your friends. Grandparents and aunts and uncles do have a bit of a special dispensation to give cash, but for the most part, we can't give cash to each other. It's just weird. So I'm not saying go out and give cash. Let's be clear about what I'm not saying. But gift cards are a lot like cash in the sense that they give control over the choice to the recipient. I mean, again, they're kind of like brain-damaged cash because they're cash that only works in some places, but nevertheless, they seem to be appealing. And so Robert Solow has this famous joke about how computers are everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And that was a while ago. Now apparently they are made cameo appearances in the productivity statistics. But what about gift cards? So they're everywhere. Are they available? Are they visible in the retail sales statistics? So here we see what this is that January drop-off, December versus January. And gift cards were sort of nothing 15 years ago, and they've grown explosively in the US in the last 10, 15 years. And I put this red line about at the dawn of the gift card era. And what you do see is this January drop-off reaches pretty unprecedented levels in recent years. And I think it's precisely when the gift cards have grown and because of them. The next slide focuses specifically on general merchandise or department stores, Macy's, that sort of thing. And it's even more pronounced there. So I think that, yes, indeed, we do see evidence of the gift cards in the retail sales statistics. So they're a big deal. All right. How am I doing? I mean, I'm okay? All right. I talk fast. I don't know if that's good or bad. So I need to sort of anticipate some natural criticisms that I think reasonable people could have of all this. One thing economists like to think, two things. One is that, well, if something's voluntary, it must by its very nature be good. So stop complaining. This is all voluntary giving. So what are you complaining about, you know? And a related complaint that economists would level at many things is, well, look, this has been going on for a long time, and there's no way an inefficient institution could persist. You know, maybe something like this could happen once or twice, but no, people would figure out ways. And I have some sympathy for these arguments, even though I'm sort of dripping with scorn as I say them. Is it voluntary? Well, so ask yourself this thought experiment. May I stiff mom at the holidays? You know, may I show up without a gift for mom? There's no law that says you have to bring mom a gift. You won't go to jail if you don't bring mom a gift. But are you really free not to? You know, if your answer is no, as that's my answer, then that means we can't infer that it's optimal just because it's being done. That inference is only allowed for voluntary behavior. Only voluntary choices imply that the choice was better than the alternative. Mandatory behaviors don't imply that. So I dispute just how voluntary it is. I think it's more of what sociologists call a normative behavior, something we do because we're supposed to do. I mean, why do we all set the table with the fork on the left? Is that individually optimal? No. It's just we do it because that's what we do. Now, how about its persistence? I think typically when economists see bad things happening to good people, they figure it must be because there are some bad incentives out there somewhere. You know, the incentive schemes are not somehow aligned with what ought to happen. So that's how you get financial crises, and maybe that's how you get this sort of gift giving. So, you know, think about the worst gift giving instances. And again, we're back to grandma. I apologize to grandma, but you know, so grandma gives the grandson a gift, and he opens it and says, you know, this is awful, grandma. I hate this. Why did you give this to me? That would be an example of sharp incentives or a clear feedback that gets grandma the knowledge she's made a mistake, and of course then she would improve. But that's not what Junior does. We didn't raise Junior that way. And by the way, I am not saying that Junior should behave that way. I think it's right and proper that Junior doesn't behave that way. It would be, you know, awful if he did. But the point is, there really isn't very clear feedback. Not only was grandma obliged to give, but Tommy, if it's Tommy or whoever, is obliged to pretend to like it. And so, you know, she's not stupid. She knows he didn't really like it. But there's really no guidance on how to do better. You know, at work, when you do something bad, they spank you, but not sort of with gift giving. All right. Now for the guilt-inducing part of the show. I mean, there are, amid all this stuff that I would call waste, some folks would just say that the spending, regardless of whether it's satisfying or not, is excessive, you know, $145 billion. But my quibble or quarrel is with the waste, not with the spending. And amid all this waste, there are lots of, I think, good causes that go begging. The world income distribution is very unequal. I have a picture on that, but you probably already know that. You know, the bottom 80% of world population, where you aggregate them by countries, so this sort of understates how bad it is, has 20% of world GDP. Now, who cares is one answer. I mean, another answer is, well, you know, if there's diminishing marginal utility, if you get tired of stuff as you have more and more of it, which is surely true with bananas, but not so obviously true with money, right? Because with money, I get tired of bananas, I can buy boats, and if I get tired of boats, I can buy cars. But still, you know, it's quite plausible to me, although not definitely demonstrable, that people get tired of stuff, and therefore, you know, their billions of dollars less important to them than my first dollar is to me. But we don't really need to invoke Karl Marx here to make a case for sharing. A lot of sharing really occurs voluntarily. I mean, so there's famous examples of Ted Turner giving $1 billion to, you know, to the UN. I don't know if he actually gave it. He pledged it. Did he give it? I'm not sure. But Warren Buffett gave billions and billions of dollars to the Gates Foundation, and lots of individuals voluntarily give stuff. In fact, the next slide is kind of interesting. If you look at giving, now this is another one of these income elasticity of demand pictures. Now this is for household data across households in the US. And so what we're looking at is categories of expenditure according to whether they're a luxury or a necessity. Again, a bar above 1 indicates luxury. A bar sort of below 1 but above 0 indicates necessity. So what are the things that are really luxuries? So savings or pensions. Cash contributions to charity is the second one, a really clear luxury. Education, entertainment, transportation, and so forth, alcohol. And then we get down to clothing, food, and then healthcare appears differently in the cross-section for reasons that aren't worth talking about today. All right, so the point of all this, though, is that charitable giving, unlike holiday giving, is a clear luxury, which means something it seems people want to do more of as they have more money. which maybe gives us a little bit of guidance for solutions. So I want to talk a little bit about solutions to this horrible problem that I've identified, if you at all are convinced. So first of all, what are not the solutions? So I'm not misunderstood. To simply not give is not the solution. Because I take the point that givers may get some joy from giving. And if they didn't give anything, they wouldn't get that joy. And since I'm after, producing satisfaction, anything that misses out on that satisfaction might not be a good thing. So it's not so obvious that the answer is not to give. The second answer that's not the answer is simply give cash. Again, I think cash is something that, although it's flexible and it allows the recipient to choose, it's awkward. I don't think it makes people unhappy, so I don't think it's a great idea. So what should we do? Well, first of all, I think we should go ahead and keep on giving to people we know well, where we have a reason to expect that our guest will be, a well-appreciated one. We saw that graph. A lot of folks are in a good position to make good choices, so keep on giving, especially to children. I really don't want to see kids crying like on the cover of the book. So that's one. But what about those situations where you have an obligation to give, but you have no idea what to do? I think, again, gift cards are an attractive alternative. Again, in principle, they're kind of stupid, but the thing is they've gotten around the stigma of cash. They're very high on the list of most appreciated gifts. So, they're like cash, but they avoid the stigma. I think of it as sort of money laundering or satisfaction laundering. It's a way to move the decision-making over to somebody else so they can get what they want. I have a big quibble about them, though. 10% of their value is never redeemed. That ends up being recognized as revenue by the retailer, so it becomes profit. Well, retailers are people too, but having said that, I don't think that givers wanted to make that transfer to retailers. So I really wish that retailers would issue a new kind of gift card, which by default, after 24 months, the unspent balances went straight to charity. I'm told it's about as likely as world peace, but we'll see. And the other thing, though, that I think is a neat idea for gifts among adults, you have an obligation to give, no idea what to do. How about a charity gift card? That's a card that allows your recipient to choose which of a list of charities gets the money. Now, remember, we saw just a few slides ago that charitable giving is a luxury activity. Well, one of the things we try to accomplish with gift giving is to let our recipient experience a luxury they can't normally afford. Could be chocolates, could be jewelry, but it turns out it's also charitable giving. So if I give you the gift card, you get to act like a rich guy, and some worthy recipient gets the money. No value needs to get destroyed, and we all get to feel good about doing something useful. So if that's a comfortable alternative for you in your situation, think about that instead of buying something that nobody wants. So I guess I would say I would like to bid you happy and efficient holidays. Thank you.